Take a network break, choose from our fine selection of air-fried virtual donuts, and join us as we peruse this week's tech news. Today, the news is focused on issues more around technology, where 5G gets less attention, Dell's AI strategy is struggling a little bit, and an ISP is replacing 600,000 routers after a hacker wiped the whole lot for no apparent reason. That's got to be a good day. We're sponsored today by iTential. Improve your network automation from one-off scripts only you can use to safe, robust automations you can share with your entire IT organization. Find out more at itential.com/packetpushers. That's ITENTIAL.com/packetpushers. It's a kind of a useful place where you can take your scripts and scale them up. We'll talk more about them halfway through the show. And of course, if you like Network Break, check out our other podcasts, including Day 2 DevOps, Heavy Networking, IPv6 Buzz, Heavy Strategy, and Packet Protector. Lots of tech analysis and compelling conversations around all parts of the enterprise IT infrastructure stack, including cloud, professional development, and much more. Find them all at packetpushers.net. All right, let's get into the news. I think the first news I picked out today is that HPE is adapting to a 5G market. And what it's done this week is announced that it's unloading some of its BSS, OSS assets inside of its telco business unit. So the background here is that sales to telcos are falling significantly across every category. So basically, what we've seen since the 5G market got all lit up and everybody got very excited, and there was so much happening there, and everybody was thinking that 5G RAN market was just going to be totally blown open. And now what they're realizing is that really it's a much more complicated market. One of the things that set them off was the Open RAN standards, which particularly started to make it possible to displace the big three in telco markets, which is Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung. And so we saw a lot of companies like Cisco, HPE, Dell, VMware setting up telco business units so that they could get involved. Johna, what do you think about this? Is HPE adapting to the fact that the 5G market's in decline for the time being, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think there's a little bit more going on, Greg, which is this is all in line with HPE's increasing focus on undercutting Cisco by emphasizing reduced cost of infrastructure operations. That was the motivation behind acquiring Juniper, and that deal is supposed to go through in 2025. This also plays into its acquisition almost 10 years ago of Aruba, with this whole notion of we are making infrastructure, whether wired or wireless, whether carrier or enterprise, easier to use, easier to manage. And in fact, they just recently talked about this whole concept of market fatigue around infrastructure, which basically is highlighting the fact that they're going head to head with Cisco. They're planning to make a pitch that says, buy our stuff because Cisco's is so much more complex to manage and use, and we want to reduce the cost of operations. So their whole pitch in a nutshell is AI ops plus cloud management plus integrated security equals lower op cost.
I'm okay with that. I think the interesting part here is that what used to be a market locked up by Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung was sort of broken open by the Open RAN movement. The idea here that you would move away from this proprietary closed appliance market that they used to have to running more of it in x86 servers. And I think, HP, Dell, and Cisco woke up and went, x86 servers, I can smell money. Do you know what I mean? And so they all wrapped out. So like HP went out and bought OpsRamp, Athonet, and Axis Security, so that they could be deployed into the 5G story, right? And then, but what they also bought was a bunch of BSS software, and they're now selling this to a company called HCLTech. Now, HCLTech is an outsourcing company primarily based in India, lots and lots of people, and very well suited to taking over like a complex, deep stack that's tightly integrated somewhere between the OSS, which is the operating environment, and the business side. So the data that comes out of the network then feeds into the accounting system is what we're talking about here.
I think the thing you're leaving unstated, Greg, is OSS BSS is actually legacy software designed in the era of TDM. So it has nothing to do with wireless, nothing to do with wired. It existed 50 years ago, and it is hopelessly complex. I think HPE is doing the intelligent thing of getting hardware, whether it's wired, wireless, doesn't matter, with ease of management built in. And that's really the main story here. It's the 5G piece is important, but I think it's the bigger story is HPE going, we're streamlining the management and operations of your infrastructure.
So they are focusing on the thing they do well, which is not the business software that sits on top, not the integration with the accounting software and so forth.
Not exactly. Basically, to be successful, telcos are going to need to move away from OSS and BSS anyway.
Yeah.
because it is hopelessly complex and outdated. So they're essentially
Yeah.
doing the smart thing and saying, hell no, we're not gonna do that, sell that stuff. We're gonna sell stuff that's built in to be ready and readily managed and easily managed. And I think that's
Yeah.
really the story here is standing up and saying, you know what? Telcos are doing things a certain way because they've done things a certain way for
hmm
50 years. That way is obsolete, and we're going to move forward with the new way.
So one little factoid from HCL, one of the interesting things here is that the HP press release and the HCLTech press release widely divergent. That's not normally what we see.
That's
The
true.
HCLTech protect release is quite something. It says right down at the back, it says, as part of this agreement, approximately 1,500 employees of CTG with telecom industry experience will transfer to HCLTech in various countries, Spain, Italy, India, Japan, and China, to service clients globally. That's a lot of headcount.
It is. It is a lot of headcount. I think what's going on here again is, if you think about it, when you were transitioning away from COBOL, you gave everybody the COBOL headcount.
Yeah.
The people that can work this arcane stuff are not an asset.
It sounds to me like it's a really heavy professional services business where there's a
Yes.
lot of you're selling some software, but really what you're talking about is, oh, this telco bought our software and we've got to put 50 headcount in there indefinitely. And I think that
Exactly.
the way HP is today is it's not being rewarded for owning headcount. So moving this to a company that loves to have headcount, and HCL Tech is largely an Indian company,
Outsourcer. Yeah.
which got access to, outsourcer is really where it came from. And these days really exists to grow, to support the Indian economy. So it makes sense to me in that sense. But I think it's also matched by the collapse in the telco market, which is down approximately 25% this quarter. So in terms of infrastructure sales, so they're buying 25% less. And it's only a year ago that the market was growing at 15%. So imagine if you're a technology vendor and, you're selling routers into this market and it was 15% up Q1 2023. Now Q1 2024, the market's shrinking by 25%. That's a long way to turn around. So
it really is. And it's also the case that I just keep reiterating. If you're making a lot of money selling people to manage obsolete software, that's the first thing that's going to go in a downturn.
all right, let's move on to the next topic. Dell Financial suggests some AI bumpy road, shall we say? They had announced their results this week. Q2 revenue of 23.5 billion to 24.5 billion, with an earnings per share of 165. That is slightly above the consensus, but the interesting part about, although the earnings per share was way under consensus, which was pretty bad, but they also then predicted that the financial year 25 revenue will now be substantially below expectations. So where before they were predicting 94.5 billion, it's now down to 93.5 billion. So a whole $1 billion drop in revenue is the current projection. And the earning per share is going to fall away a little bit. The gross margin's down 150 basis points and the shares fell by 12%. Now, I think there's lots of ways you can look at this. If you read the financial results and then you go and look at the analyst conversations and the various reviews, I'm going to pick out just one angle of this, Johna, and that is that what's clear is that the low margins on sales for AI servers was weighing on their gross margin and earning per shares. And they actually said that AI optimized server orders increased by nearly 40% sequentially, and we shipped 800 million of AI optimized servers, and our backlog nearly doubled sequentially, exiting the year at 2.9 billion. So decoding that, okay, we've sold 800 million of AI optimized servers, but now we have an order backlog for 2.9 billion. So obviously the thing here is access to NVIDIA GPUs, and it's several times in the call and in the results that they published, they talked about how they're struggling to get access to enough GPUs to fulfill demand. But what I went in and read the analyst conversation. So when the analysts, when they go backwards and forward between the analysts and the executives, and they said our AI optimized servers orders increased by 2.6 billion, but our backlog is now 3.8. And so the analyst came along and said, hang on, are you saying that your AI server orders are up 1.2 billion? And they went, yes. He said, but your server orders in your other team are down 1.2 billion. And they went, yes. And he said, does that mean that AI servers are cannibalizing your server business? And they went, well, no, it means that we're growing our AI business. The answer,
Well, no, but yes.
You know what I'm leading to here, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
right. Well, I think the way to interpret this, Greg, is less, AI isn't growing the market. Obviously, it's growing the market for AI servers substantially, but it's also completely cratered the market for non-AI servers. And I think that's basically the
Yes.
case with any disruptive technology. It comes along and it says, oh, anything that's not me is now automatically obsolete once again. So I think at least in the short term, you're absolutely correct with your implication that AI is cannibalizing all non-AI servers because nobody wants them anymore. And putting Dell in a bind because they can't get enough hardware to sell their AI optimized servers. But I think that's a short-term effect. I think overall AI will in fact grow the market. Then again, analysts are always short-term. All they care about is the next quarter. So for the next quarter, absolutely,
Yes, true,
that is the case.
Yeah, it's just interesting because normally the vendors are running around saying AI is going to grow the market. Customers are going to buy more product than ever. And at this point in time,
they're not wrong. It's just that they're buying more product of, well, no, very demonstrably, because if they're selling AI servers, AI server sale is up 40%. Definitely people are buying more. It's just that people are buying less non-AI.
Yeah, but if it's taking away sales of other servers, so what it's actually saying is people are buying AI-enabled servers instead of buying non-AI servers. So it's just a like-for-like transition.
Except
and
it's not like it's like everything else. It's like client server meant that mainframe sales slowed down, and desktops meant that client server sales slowed down. That's kind of how it works, and we're in the early stages of the disruption happening. So everything that is not the old stuff is now is not the AI stuff is now obsolete. So I think they're absolutely correct you're absolutely correct in the short term. And again, analysts think very short term. 2 years from now, it's going to be a whole different conversation. But 2 years from now, let's hope
I'm not so sure. I think 2 years out, I think servers will cost the same. They will all be AI enabled by default, and there's no growth here. It's just basically replacement.
Well, no, servers will continue to grow.
One of the other things that you sort of I read into some of the subtext going out is I think Dell's been caught flat-footed on networking. So in AI,
I think I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. And the network is a critical asset. NVIDIA's proven that Ethernet and PCIe isn't sufficient. And that's why they continue to push NVLink or NVIDIA Link and InfiniBand for super high performance. Now, Dell has to follow the Broadcom ASIC and architectures because that's where they get their ASICs from. They just buy them in the same way they buy Intel CPUs, right? And they use Sonic as a NOS that they've got. They've got a development team around that. But now you have to go into the NOS and make changes for potentially whatever Ultra Ethernet will do. And then you have to build a operating system above that, and a software-defined operating platform that can actually implement all the configuration management and the prioritization and all that sort of stuff. The question that you can ask is, can Dell be a networking vendor with strong quality network software in the data center? And that is not necessarily immediately true. Dell is not normally a company that writes software, produces its own internal software. And if it does, I mean, that's not true for the storage business unit, of course, because that's where when they bought EMC, they got all of that. But they haven't had the same heritage behind networking. Do you think it's worth? Do you think that's an angle?
I think it's a really interesting question to raise. I don't have a defined position here. That said, I think the question of networking plus AI computation, in other words, AI-enabled servers and AI-enabled computation, is actually going to become very, very interesting over the next several years, because one of the things people are starting to see is that data centers aren't good enough for AI. You're actually going to melt down your data centers if you try to do all your AI inside data centers, and quite literally melt down. We'll talk about this shortly, but there's, the power consumption of AI is tremendous. So the question is, how are you going to have an infrastructure architecture that effectively and efficiently, including power efficiently, handles AI? And that's where you're going to see things like AI edge and neuromorphic computing that we'll get to in a little bit. So long story short, I think there's absolutely an opportunity for Dell here. Can it take advantage of the opportunity? Ooh, I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah. I think they can. They can throw enough money at it. They've got plenty of money and plenty of motivation. But here's one thing this was something I was tossing around in the Packet Pusher Slack this week, and also over on LinkedIn. One thing is that I wonder if companies like Dell should consider using InfiniBand, but instead of saying, here's InfiniBand and it's a replacement for Ethernet in AI, what they should do is pitch it as a replacement for fiber channel, right?
I think that's a really interesting idea, Greg. I'm not sure they'd go for it, but I think it's a great idea.
If you're trying to sell InfiniBand as an AI networking, that's not a big market. But if you're saying, why don't you stop futzing around with fiber channel, upgraded to InfiniBand, which has all the features of Fibre Channel that storage people want, and most of your storage arrays already support IB, right? They already support and InfiniBand. The Fibre Channel maximum speed is 128 gig. That is not ready for AI. InfiniBand is already at 400 gig, going up to 800 gig already because it uses very similar equipment to Ethernet, where Fibre Channel is kind of like a little bit different. So if they suddenly said, you know what we need to do is say all of our storage needs to go InfiniBand and replace your Fibre Channel. And then, of course, the vendors have got hundreds of millions of dollars then to force an upgrade cycle into customers. And then they could scale that up to say, okay, so AI servers get InfiniBand and Ethernet networks. You do the AI over InfiniBand, but you use Ethernet for everything else. And I think that is, I'm sure they've already thought of this and discarded it, but that to me there's a certain amount of sense to that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're doing them a little bit too much justice by suggesting that. I'm sure a couple of engineers have thought of that. I hope senior management is listening to you.
It just seems to make sense to me. And the trick is, of course, well, InfiniBand they're going to say InfiniBand's not a big enough market when it could be if you replaced all the Fibre Channel out there.
It's a bigger market than any other alternative at the moment, any other viable alternative.
That's right. And probably you wouldn't have to put up with all of this. Let's keep the legacy of Ethernet alive for another decade, because, at the end of the day, you can strap rocket engines onto a pig and the pig will fly, but don't be underneath it when it lands. Let's talk about Windstream. Windstream is an ISP that's actually had to replace over 600,000 routers in its network. Interestingly, Lumen has actually published quite a substantial blog post about what happened here. A hacker got inside the network, managed to find that the code that's on the routers that they're using out there is not really up to scratch, found a custom vulnerability, which is a fork of an existing vulnerability, and then literally burned them all down for no apparent reason. There was no threat. There was no whatever. That sort of points at a nation-state attacker, maybe China, maybe Russia, perhaps. But, yeah, how would you like to be working for a company with 600,000 routers dead and the only way out of them is to send out new ones to customers?
I don't want to be the guy that recommended HCLTech off-brand routers. That's all I can say. I mean, that's the thing to keep in mind. These were not standard routers. Keep in mind also that Windstream is serving an awful lot of underprivileged sites, so that meant they had to be cost-cutting. And this is what happens when you cost cut where you kind of shouldn't. And let's keep in mind that all of this happened back in October. This is the kind of thing that's been happening on a rolling thunder for at least the past 18 months. I don't want to downplay the pain that this caused Windstream and its customers, but they're pretty clearly behind the curve protecting against malware. Maybe the moral to the story is don't buy off-brand routers, cut costs somewhere else.
Well, that's what they all do. I mean, the thing is, in telcos, the only way for them to, maximize profits is to stop buying brand name routers.
No, but the second tier and third tier telcos, maybe top tier telcos are buying, as we talked about earlier, folks like Juniper. In fact, Juniper is pretty well widespread in telcos at this point, simply because it's got integrated security and ease of management. And that's kind of why that stuff matters.
Well, the thing here is that they actually burned it down. So they actually, all of those back channel things for configuration and all that, they burned all that down. And it's not like they used a well-known attack vector. So the Lumen report says, at this time, we are unsure of the exploit to gain initial access, but they can decode what happened after the initial access. So it's not like these people got it wrong in some way.
Well, they did. They were using they were using off-brand routers for which there isn't a large community of folks protecting them. And they just kind of said, you know what, it's cheaper to replace everything than try to figure out what the heck happened here. And that makes sense. That is what happens when you make those kinds of decisions. The other interesting thing, which you brought up earlier, is that this was nowhere reported in any of their financial information, which it doesn't have to be. In fairness, Windstream did not have to report any of this, so there was no reason for them to do it. They're privately held, but it is interesting that they didn't bring it up. And replacing 600,000 routers, you would think, would be something you might notice with a sentence or two saying, gosh, our operational costs went, our capital costs went up unexpectedly this year.
Yeah, it just seems like, I just can't imagine what that operation looks like. Are you sending out people with a router that's been reflashed and replacing the one that's been wiped? And you've got to do that for 600,000 potential customers. That's just a lot of work for not too much of a gain.
Speaking of operations that must have been a lot of fun, there was the largest police action against botnets ever that just concluded, called Operation Endgame, just concluded May 29th, and had participation from France, Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, the US, and Ukraine. I basically arrested 4 people, but took 2,000 domains and put them under control of law enforcement because essentially these were all servers operating botnets for various attacks. And one of the main suspects earned at least $74.5 million or 69 million euros in cryptocurrency by renting out these servers, which it had taken over to deploy ransomware. So it's interesting to see that global law enforcement is starting to take this kind of stuff very, very seriously and can effectively take it down. And the whole notion of 2,000 domains under the control of law enforcement is sobering.
But I saw some of the Ukraine media coverage of this, and the hackers were actually caught in the nude. And the Ukrainian police all turned up with very large guns, looking very, very serious, by the way. But it was pretty funny. It must be a bit of a wake up for the hackers to suddenly wake up to a bunch of Ukrainian police at the door, picking you up in the middle of the night, giving you a bit of a fright. So I wonder if it'll have an impact, especially if some of the hackers out there start to see that sort of stuff and think, Ukraine used to be a safe place for hackers and now it's not. Of course, this was a global initiative. Britain, United States, I think the US had a similar one going on this week. Anyway, let's take a moment to thank our sponsor, for iTential. You need a network automation system that's not fragile, that anyone in your org can use, and that leverages the automation work you've already done. So all of those scripts you've got out there with Ansible and Python, you still want to be able to use them, but you've got to start scaling this up. iTential gives you all of this. With iTential, you'll be able to run your scripts safely as a workflow that integrates with your change management, with your IPAM monitoring, ticket system, and anything else you need, really. iTential doesn't just save you CLI time, it touches everything that needs updating and testing when you need to make a network change. And iTential is low code. You don't have to be a software developer to use it. Whether you're just getting started with network automation or you're deep down the rabbit hole of GitOps and pipelines, iTential can help. Automate the whole process from ticket creation to ticket closure with iTential. Find out more at itential.com/packetpushers. That's iTential, ITENTIAL.com/packetpushers. Thanks to iTential for their support. They've been a long-time supporter of the show. Moving on to our next topic, power consumption of data centers could exceed 9% of U.S. electricity by 2030. This is a report put out by a government research body called EPRI, and they were doing a bit of a research into the future of the power system, which I thought was pretty interesting. And they're saying that by 2030, 9% of U.S. electricity could be pumped into into data centers. They didn't explicitly say data centers, but what they did say in the report was that they were very concerned about the sheer amount of energy that AI might concern to suddenly bump up that whole process.
Well, and I think this is also not new news, but I think this reinforces something we've already known. The CTO of AMD put out a report about 2 years ago showing pretty much that same time frame, 2030 to 2040, was when power consumption by AI could actually exceed all available power in the U.S. And interestingly enough, our next news item will talk a little bit about that. But I think the solution is fundamentally change how AI and other high power intensity computation runs. And you'll see things like the Spin Cloud Systems, which is a brand new startup that was done in a is a spinoff from a German research university that has a neuromorphic computer that distributes processing across the platform with the explicit goal of minimizing power consumption. And they actually do work that way. They are effective infrastructure for ultimately quantum computing, if and when we get there, and AI for the here and now.
Yeah, I think I see that as sort of like once you're burning up power at the rate that we are today, the natural thing is that, the solid capitalist thing is to start finding ways to reduce power consumption, right?
What exactly? And the nice thing is that we're already there. I won't say it solved the problem, but we're definitely going in that right direction. I think the other thing to keep in mind is what I mentioned earlier, this notion of AI edge computing, which is you want to distribute the workloads, whether it's AI or anything else, where they make the most sense. And that makes the most sense from power availability, power consumption, network.
The challenge I have with AI edge is the grid. So the national power grids in, say, Europe, the UK and the US are not in a good state. They were mostly built 70 years ago, and they haven't necessarily had the necessary maintenance over that time frame to keep them ready to go. And people say, oh, we'll just move the AI to the edge. But if you start just moving the power, distributing the power further out, that just puts more and more load on the grid.
Yes, but no. I would agree with you notionally that the grid is, really needs refurbishing and upgrading and enhancing, and we're seeing that start to happen. But the thing about AI Edge is it actually moves it away from the remote location, which is the data center, because remember, data centers are typically located in very remote locations at this point, closer to the metro area where the grid may be more robust. So I'm not sure how much of an impact grid inherent weakness is going to have here. That said, I agree with you 100% that it needs to be refreshed, updated for the AI era.
My instinct here is that there'll be a reaction to this. You just can't afford to can't afford to spend 200 million running a model of
exactly.
which, 150 million is electricity, because, there are data centers are now struggling to get electricity allocations. And
I completely agree. And, when you think about electricity and you think about power, you mentioned the grid, and we talk about the location of the grid, and we mentioned the platform, but there's also the question of sourcing. And I think, Greg, you wanted to raise the point that you may be recanting slightly from modular nuclear reactors. I know you and I talked about this on Heavy Strategy, and we were both super gung-ho, but now you're maybe backing off a little bit.
I am. I went on to do some research after that show. It was over on Heavy Strategy, and we published it about, how do you power a data center? And the idea that you could get a small modular reactor, nuclear reactor, that would put out, 100 to 500 megawatts, which is just the right size for a data center. And the idea would be is that every data center comes with an SMR or two, for resilience and redundancy, instead of building out, what they do today, where they put gas generators or diesel generators, natural gas generators or diesel generators of various sorts, plus some solar and some other stuff as well, right? And like, you can't power a data center with solar. You can supplement or boost some of your power consumption or reduce the cost of your power consumption by putting a bunch of solar around, but you still, at the end of the day, need a 24-hour supply. So for a while, I considered that small modular reactors was a possible future. And then after doing the research, I realized there is not a single small modular reactor under construction in the world today, right? Realistically, all of the SMRs that are out there are all preliminary designs coming from various companies. Now, the one in the UK that was doing it was BAE, British Aerospace. They are long-time builders of nuclear power plants, and they, unpacked all of their specialists and started to design a small modular reactor and dropped a couple of $100 million into the design of it. And they've just abandoned it and said, this is not ever going to work. There's no future for it. And if you keep digging away, there was one company in the US that had a permit for 2 small modular reactors, and they just handed it back and walked away from it because they couldn't get the permits to actually start the construction, and they were starting to run out of money. So they abandoned it. So I'm suddenly starting to think, like, there is so much solar energy and wind energy in the world, right, that I think the people who are looking at nuclear are going like, well, hang on, I've already got too much solar and too much wind. What I really have is a battery problem, not a generation problem. Does that make sense?
Well, hold that thought, because I just want to clarify that things aren't entirely gloomy on the SMR front. Just Friday, last Friday, I should say, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission accepted TerraPower's small modular reactor construction permit, and they're scheduling it for review. I think the issue here is it's become more of a horse race, because I think we can all agree that it's great to have, a permit under review, but that's nowhere near having a reactor generating power. And at the best case scenario, we're looking at 3 to 5 years, and possibly more like a decade before these power plants come out.
I think you're looking at 3 years. I think you're looking at a minimum of 3 years.
Exactly.
Like, once you've got a permit.
Best case, yeah.
Then you've got to go to a local government somewhere and a state government and say, I want to put a small nuclear.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So we're looking at minimum 3 years, more realistically 5, and possibly even a decade before these things go out to work. So the real question here becomes not which is better, but which is actually going to be here first. And I think you had some good eye-opening data about the state of California and the use of renewables.
That's right. So California is already generating more than 100% of its energy, not all day, just for a period in the middle of the day on a good day, but it's producing more energy than it needs. And it either exports that or just throws it away, or it gets diverted into batteries if they've got them.
Well, yeah, very specifically in California for 45 days straight in the past year, and 69 days out of 75 days, California wind, solar, hydro has exceeded demand for part of each day. On May 20th, it was at 7.58 hours, peaking at 135% of demand. So that basically says we're getting very close to the ability to to fill the power requirements with wind, solar, hydro, et cetera.
Yeah, so what you haven't got is so the advantage of small modular reactors or of power plants like coal or nuclear or, gas type stuff is that you can turn them on whenever you want at night, for example, or when the wind doesn't blow, if you want to consider that. But here in the UK, they've been having situations where they've been running entirely off solar and wind for days at a time, up to a week at a time, with none of the fossil fuel reactors online. So the only thing that's been running is the base load coming out of our nuclear reactors. We have half a dozen nuclear reactors, and everything else comes from wind and solar. None of the gas peakers, none of the background. Now, in winter, of course, that's a different story. But the point here is generation is kind of covered. And like you can go and look at Singapore, they've got simple numbers. Electricity in the US, wind and solar is already, give or take a bit, more than 15, less than 20% of the total in 2024. So something like 50 to 20% of the total electricity generation for the US is wind and solar today. Texas has got some extraordinary numbers. They're like 60 to 70% green energy. For a country, for a state that's all about oil, they don't use it for generating electricity.
The point that you alluded to a little bit earlier, Greg, is worth bringing out and shining a spotlight on, which is battery technologies have improved dramatically. And I think, I am no fan of Elon Musk, but one thing he has done is really focused time, attention, and energy on batteries. And I think as our battery power improves, that solves the problem that you highlighted, which is how do you run the data center at night?
Well, you only got a battery problem if you've got enough generation. And that was never clear. Right.
That we would.
And now we're seeing so many different energy storage solutions. Like there's a company in the US that's producing sodium ion batteries of a particular type. So they don't even use lithium, which addresses that bottleneck. We're looking at pumped hydro. You're looking at air going underground. You're looking at various types of iron salt batteries, which are at power generator scale. These things take up enormous amounts of space. There's another one which is based around sand. Rather than go into all of those, that's not what we're here for. But the point is that once you've got the sheer amount of generation that you've got, then what you have is not a generation problem presented by solar and wind. What you have is a storage problem. And that's why I'm starting to think small modular reactors aren't going to work, because by the time they get up, by the time somebody brought them to market,
solving a problem that doesn't matter anymore. As we've highlighted, the problems are less about generation, more about storage, and as we said in the last note, distribution. And SMRs don't help with either of those. Well, they help a little bit with this distribution, but not a lot.
Except for the limited use case of a data center, and that's not enough of a use case for them to be sustainable. Right. Lastly, a few more. We've got this week I was looking at the John Deere. They had a problem in Colorado. I think they're based. Anyway, they had a court case this week. 404 Media had the story, and they were highlighting that John Deere is now struggling to maintain its monopoly over tractor repair. And what's happening over in the US is that, if in particular, but also globally, is that if you buy a John Deere tractor, it must be worked on by a certified engineer. We heard that before. And those tractors, that certified engineer has to come out with a laptop, and any part that goes into the tractor must have a license installed onto it to run on that tractor. And it must be able to connect back to the head office and the software. And what they're finding is, A, there's not enough engineers. B, the engineers don't know how to use the software. And C, the farmers are sitting there saying, oh, I need to put this part on, but they have to wait 3 days for somebody to come out. And then their crops are in the field rotting away, and so forth and so on. Now, the story here is, obviously there's a right to repair, but I think it's also a right to use issue, Jonah. These farmers want to be able to use their equipment, and that means for them particularly, I want to repair it so I can get on. And that means, if the air conditioner in the cab isn't working, just turn it off. We'll get going. We'll wait 3 days. We'll run without the air conditioner until do you know what I mean? Or if there's something going on and I need to put in a non-standard part or bypass it for a while so I can get the crops in, that's what I want to do. I don't want to have to wait 3 days for a certified engineer to come out with a spare part and run the software on it, that sort of stuff. I just wonder, does that map into enterprise IT? Is there a crossover that you could pick up out of that?
Oh, well, there absolutely is. And you mentioned Colorado. Actually, John Deere is headquartered in Illinois. But in Colorado this week, they just passed a right to repair law that covers cell phones and computers, which are widely used in enterprise IT. Interestingly, it does not cover routers. I wonder which lobbyist is getting their enormous paycheck for that from Cisco and Juniper and HPE.
Routers don't belong to voters; they belong to companies, Jonah. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
but I think I want to tease out the right to use and right to repair, because right to repair has some degree of agility in it. Yes, you want to fix it right away and get on moving. But more importantly, if all the tools to repair it are suddenly special and secret and locked up and differentially sold, that actually is illegal. And that's what they're going after in Colorado. If you are a vendor of enterprise IT equipment, except routers, you must make available all the tools that are also made available to authorized resellers and to repair shops. And I think that's an incredibly important move. Now, you're stressing also the right to use, which starts to get a little difficult because, for example, if you're using cloud services and you decide to use them in ways that the owner of the cloud has explicitly prohibited, I don't know that there's necessarily supposed to be a right to use, because a right to use can easily become a right to abuse. And there's decades of settled law on this from carriers, because carriers are basically within their rights to say, you may not touch our network, you may not change our network, you may not do anything on our network because it's our network. And if you do that, it'll take it down. And I think the cloud providers, the Microsofts and the Googles of the world, are on solid ground saying the same thing about cloud services. So right to use...
Well, I mean, you've got to be careful here. You've got to not mix up right to repair with right to use.
I'm not. I'm specifically differentiating above the two.
Yeah, so no, I understand that. I'm throwing into the conversation. So repairing an iPhone or, any sort of smartphone is practical because Apple produces one model of iPhone, and therefore for companies to manufacture spare parts and jigs and tools, because taking apart an iPhone is a specialist skill, but you also need specialist tools. If you're going to desolder a chip from that smartphone, then you need to have a spare chip to put in it. And you can't just do that by building up a stock, by stitching, by deconstructing.
Which enterprise organizations are well equipped to do with both cell phones and desktop computers and laptops, which this law covers. So I think absolutely.
So there's an angle there. But what I also think is, and then if you put in non-standard Apple parts into an Apple iPhone, it won't recognize them, or it'll throw up a message saying you've got a non-standard screen. Now, that came out of a basis that at one stage, Apple was losing $1 billion a year in revenue because people were using third-party parts in phones and then turning up in Apple's offices saying, my phone's broken, and then they take it apart and it's got third-party components that aren't up to spec. And people were blaming Apple, and Apple's brand was being damaged. So part of what they did was a reaction to that, right? Guaranteeing that the replacement components are of sufficient quality.
Most of it was simply just locking in revenue, but carry on.
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to it, is all I'm saying. I don't know which side of this I stand on. But what I'm more thinking, and I don't think you'll ever repair a server. You're not going to take a Dell or a Cisco server apart and start hunting down, a faulty memory chip or a faulty line driver on the PCI bus. That's not going to happen. There's just too much variation in supply around those.
No, but desktop machines you may very well, because if the choice is, as you said earlier, if the choice is calling your authorized supplier and having them say, oh, I can be in next week, or fixing the damn thing yourself and having the user up and running 2 hours later.
It's really difficult. I used to repair laptops.
I understand. But I also have clients that are very large enterprises that do an awful lot of work on desktops and actually have to set up configuration for them because they're government agencies and things like that. So there are enterprise organizations that will have the capability.
If you're a super high security institution and you don't want to send something out for repair, you could do it in-house. Maybe you would.
Yeah.
Anyway, interesting point is that if the US goes down this, and I know that the European Union is also heading down a path of right to repair, although mostly they're talking about consumer items like smartphones and so forth. But that again is because consumers vote and corporations usually don't. So maybe that's where the line is. Anyway, just a discussion point. Our final story for today: portable base stations. So this is portable mobile phone base stations are being used to locate lost people. So in this case, it's another article, interestingly, from Colorado, from the Colorado Sun. They're talking about they've been attaching a thing called a Life Seeker. It's an airborne mission system for search and rescue capable of accurately locating missing persons through their mobile phones. So basically, Jonah, what they're doing is putting a base station, a mobile phone base station on a helicopter. You go and clip it up on the legs or something, and then they fly it over the land. And they're saying within 2 minutes and 14 seconds, they found during a test mission, they were able to find the people they were looking for. Okay, surveillance works sometimes.
Well, I am a little skeptical of this because it sort of assumes that the people left their cell phones on attempting to find a signal, whereas most of us, including me personally, just having come back from a week in the outback, so to speak, will once
Yeah.
we realize we're out of signal, we'll turn the phone completely off. And I don't know that would help in that
Yes.
situation. But hey,
No,
it's
but
a
if
start.
you, yeah, if you knew it was a problem and you turned your phone on to see if you could get a signal to call for help, maybe that's a thing.
Yes.
It's just interesting to me that they're doing it on helicopters in this particular thing, but it seems to me that a drone might be better. And LifeSeeker does sell drones, but in this case, they're just using it in the article from the Colorado Sun. They're just saying they're just attaching some equipment to a helicopter because, and I was wondering, like, if you send out a drone, can you make an accurate assessment of where the person is? Can you, you know, do you get enough? If the person's there, does the drone help you assess, should I walk somebody in to retrieve these people or should I send a helicopter to pick them up? Whatever.
Yeah, I don't
Maybe that
understand
human
why they
part of the
used
analysis.
a helicopter other than it was a test and they wanted people on the site. But yeah, I agree with you. This should be fleets of
Mm.
drones.
Probably both, actually.
Yeah, probably both.
Um, Probably
And
both,
as you
like a
said,
drone to locate you, and then you send out a helicopter to do an assessment, perhaps. And then the helicopter's not, flying around in circles because a helicopter costs like $5,000 to $10,000 an hour to keep in the air. But if you
hmm
know that they're there, you can fly the helicopter right there and to do the assessment. So maybe
exactly.
that's the angle.
That may be it.
Well,
And besides, as you said, they make both. So
yeah. Well, thanks for today's show. We've run out of things to talk about. As I said, today is a little bit adjacent to IT infrastructure. Some of the news was a little bit thin this week. If you've got any topics that you'd like to hit us up on the show, head on over to the Packet Pushers Slack. If you go over to our website, packetpushers.net/Slack, you can sign up. And in there's a group for links for sharing. Drop them in there and we'll bring them forward to the show if there's something you'd like to see us discuss. And as always, don't forget that there's plenty of other shows on the Packet Pushers Network. Packet Protector and Heavy Wireless are getting a lot of airplay. Do go over and get them. Jonah, where can folks get more from you?
go ahead and hit me up on my company's website. That's nemertes.com. N like Nancy, E-M like Mary, E-R-T like Thomas, E-S.com, nemertes.com. What about you, Greg?
Mostly you can find me spitting out the occasional tweet on Twitter. And I'm also trying to be a better person on LinkedIn. That's not to say I will be a better person, but I'm trying very hard.
You're doing very well. I actually see a lot of your posts and like them and repost them. So go check Greg out on LinkedIn. Let's train him to use LinkedIn by commenting on his extremely good
it chumps
posts.
my buns. It's like fingernails down a blackboard every time I'm on that site. And as always, thanks for joining us for another episode of Network Break. If you enjoy the show, please like us on LinkedIn, leave a recommendation of Apple Podcasts, and share a link with your colleague. Thanks for listening.